Okay, so this lesson is all about curves, and the curves tool can be found right here within DaVinci. If we hover over top of it, we'll see that it says curves. Now, this is our curves graph over here. And in here, we can make very similar changes to our image as what we can do within our primary color wheels over here. Now, our primary color wheels are split up into three groups. We have our lift, gamma, and gain. Our shadows, our midtones, our highlights, and then we have the ability to make overall adjustments over here with our offset. And as we learned before, if we want to make even more specific adjustments, we can head over to the log wheels and kind of isolate our shadows, midtones, and highlights even more so that they don't bleed over into each other so that we can make more specific adjustments. And our color wheels are great, especially because we have all these additional options up here, like changing our temperature, tint. We can change the color boost, the saturation, even our hue. We have a lot of functionality within here, and we can access all of these controls very quickly and easily. Now, when I compare the curves to the color wheels, curves stand out to me because they allow us to make much more precise adjustments to any specific luminance of our image or even hue or saturation of our image in a very specific way that doesn't affect other parts of our image. This is also a different way for us to view the changes that we're making in our image. To me, I really like the visual of the curves graph a lot more than the log wheels. So I do find myself using curves a lot of the time, especially for any kind of contrast adjustments. A lot of the time I'll use my log wheels for primary adjustments, so changing things like temperature, tint, making sure skin tones look good. But then when it comes to contrast, I do like to jump over to the curves and play around with them here. And another thing to mention is the curves graph is not only to affect our contrast of our image, we can also affect individual red, green, and blue values within the highlights, shadows, midtones. It's a very powerful tool, and we can make very custom grades just with this graph over here. And there's a bunch of other types of curves graphs within the curves palette as well, and we can access all of those by pressing these little icons over here. We'll be diving into each of these later on. So let's take a look at our curves graph over here and just get an understanding of what's going on. So first of all, I want you guys to understand that the left part of the curves graph represents the darkest parts of our image, and the right part represents the brightest parts of our image. So as we can see, there's a line that goes directly through the middle of our graph over here. Now, the bottom left corner represents the black point. That's the darkest parts of our entire image. The top right represents the white point. This is the brightest parts of our entire image. By moving these 2 points on our graph, we can change the contrast of our image by manipulating the darkest and brightest points of the image. So if I grab this bottom point over here and I raise it up, what's happening? We can see that we are bringing up the darkest parts of our image. We are raising the luminance of our shadows. So those blacks that used to be pure black are no longer black, and we are starting to get this washed out look. Now, if I take this point, I bring it all the way up, we can see that we are losing a lot of that contrast because we are no longer allowing for those black values to be below this point here, which obviously does not look good, but this is just important for us to understand how this works. Now, if I bring this point over here to the right, let's take a look at what's happening. We can see that we are crushing our blacks, and our blacks are getting even darker. Now, why would that be? Well, the reason for this is because we are increasing the incline of this line over here. What we need to understand is that the incline of this line over here determines the contrast of our image. So let's say this line goes straight up and down. What's going to happen? Well, our image is going to look like this, and it's just as contrasted as it can possibly be. So at this stage, it's just a straight line. We literally just have white and black. It's as contrasted as it can possibly be. Well, what's the opposite of this? Let's bring this so that it's straight, so that it runs straight across our graph over here. And what do we have here? This is called a flat line, and what we are seeing here is just pure gray. So this is as minimal contrast as we can possibly have in our image. There's no contrast, so we pretty much don't really see anything. So it's the incline, it's the slope of the line that determines the actual contrast of our image. So let's reset this by pressing the reset button in the top right over here. Now, in this area, we don't just work with these 2 points over here at the top and bottom. We can add points anywhere along this line and move those points. So let's add a point over here, and we could bring it up. So what we've done over here is we've selected the brighter parts of our image. We're not moving the brightest parts of our image. That would be this point up here. We've kind of selected a point that's above our midtones. Our midtones would be here in the middle. So we're moving the brighter parts and making them a bit brighter. If we wanted to make them darker, we can grab that same point and bring them down like that. And we can see that we are primarily affecting that one luminance region within our image, which is closer to our highlights. So we're affecting our highlights by doing this over here. And what we can do now is create another point down here to affect our shadows, our darker parts of our image. And we can bring this down. So we're kind of crunching the shadows, making them darker. And by creating this S curve, we have increased the contrast of our image. We've made our darks darker and we've made our brights brighter. This is typically the way that most people use the custom curves over here. And this is a great way for you to make very specific contrast adjustments. Now, you don't have to work with just 2 points. You can easily add another point, or as many points as you want. So let's say we like the look of our image over here, but let's say we want to crush just the blacks even more. So what we can do is grab this point down here, bring it over to the right, and we can very precisely make the shadows a lot darker. Now, that's too dark in my opinion, but we can make those adjustments just like that to very specific parts of our image. Let's say we wanted to make those shadows even brighter, we can do that as well. Now, take note that when I am changing this point down here, the point next to it is staying in its place. So we are modifying the line between these 2 points. We can see how that line does change. And we are changing the way that the line moves after this point as well. You can see that we are affecting the line past this point as well by moving this point down here, but not as abruptly. Over here, we're kind of really making big changes, and then everything past this point kind of slows down, doesn't move as much. So we can add points to hold values as well on here. So we can use them like placeholders. So if we want a certain part of our image to stay the same, we can add a point there and treat it like a placeholder so that it won't move. And that will allow us to make more precise changes to the other points without worrying about affecting the rest of the line over here. Now I'm just going to reset this. So that's generally how people use the custom curves over here, is they create those S curves. Now we can see behind this line, we have a histogram over here. And the histogram just tells us information about our image over here. Now we can see when we make a change to our line over here, the histogram isn't updating. Now the scopes over here to the right, they are updating as I'm making these changes, but the histogram back here isn't. That's because it's just showing us our input. It's just showing us what the original image was before we've made any changes. And we can actually change that to update in real time by going to these 3 dots over here in the top right, going to histogram and changing it from input to output. This way, when I make any changes to my line over here, we can see that that histogram back there is updating in real time, which can be useful in some situations. Another important thing to note is we can very quickly delete points anywhere on our line over here by right-clicking on them. So we can left-click and drag to move them around, right-click to delete them very quickly. So in this situation, the shadows are almost clipping. And what if I wanted to just bring those down so that they weren't as intense? Well, what I could do is create a point right here on the line and treat it as like a placeholder. And what I could do is grab that bottom point, bring it up, and we can see how the histogram behind me updates in real time. And I've successfully been able to move that line further away from the left side over here without affecting the rest of my image too much. Now I can go in here and make my general S curve, play around with it a bit. But now I'm not as worried about my blacks being too far over here on the left of the histogram. I've moved them over to the right a bit. So I'm going to reset this, and I want to show you guys how we can manipulate our individual red, green, and blue channels within our custom curves over here. So over here to the right, we can see we have Y RGB. When we have Y selected, we're basically making changes to everything. It's like an overall change. If we select R over here, which is our red values, we can make specific changes to our red values anywhere within our image. If we're looking at our scopes over here to the right, we can see that our red values are much lower than our green and blue values. And that's pretty obvious because we're underwater. It makes sense. There's not as much red data down here. We don't have red light down here. It's very blue, very green. So what we can do in this case, if we want to level these out, is we can bring up the reds in the shadows over here and kind of line things up within our scopes. Now in this situation, just because our reds are lower than the greens and blues doesn't mean we need to even them out. But if we wanted to, we can do that over here. And we can see if we're watching our scopes, we can see that now we kind of have more of an even playing field with our red, green, and blue values. Now, I am primarily focusing on the shadows here, but what if I move this point up and down? Well, take note on what's happening within this red area here in the scopes. If I move this to the left over here, notice how that red channel is changing. We're kind of moving through what area is getting stretched out. So it doesn't matter if this point is up here or down here, the overall height of the red spectrum here stays the same. I'm just manipulating the actual different parts of the red channel here. Now in this situation, it doesn't really make sense to add any red to our image. We're underwater. I'm totally happy with the greens and blues taking over and not much red coming through. That's totally fine in this situation. I'm gonna right click on this dot to reset it. And of course, we can do the same thing with green and we can do the same thing with blue. We can change all of these values. Now, one thing to keep in mind with color theory is with reds, when we are increasing the reds, if we do the opposite of increase reds, we are actually increasing the cyan. So by bringing it down, we're increasing our cyan values. But with green, if we're increasing green, we're obviously increasing the green levels. But if we bring it down, we are increasing the magenta levels. So we're kind of doing the opposite of bringing in green. We are taking out green and making things more magenta, which is the opposite of green. And for blue, the opposite of blue is yellow. So when we bring in blue, we're obviously adding more blue in. When we're taking blue out, we are making our image more yellow. I'm going to bring this back to Y over here. Now over here to the top left, we can see that we have this thing here. Now, what does this do? Well, basically this allows us to set our overall range. So if I bring this down, we can see that we are highly limiting the area of which we can make these contrast changes in. We are darkening the brighter values and we are brightening the darker values by doing this. And this isn't something I personally do, but just know that this is a tool that we can access right here in the top left. It basically just limits the range that we can work with here in the curves. Now with custom curves selected, if I go over my preview window, you can see that we have an eyedropper. Now, why would we have an eyedropper? Well, we can use this eyedropper to select very specific points on our line over here. So let's say I wanted to make changes to, only the parts of my image that are this luminance over here. Well, what I could do is click on this area with the eyedropper, and what happens in our graph over here? We are presented with some points. And it's created points for our Y, R, G, and B. Now we can't see the red. If we go over to red, we'll be able to see it. It didn't create one for red because there is no red in that area. So now I know that this point is for this area over here. So if I wanted to make a very specific change to just that area, what I could do is create placeholders next to this, right? So I'll create one over here, I'll create one over here so that we're not moving the entire line. And now I can make a very specific change to just this one range within my image. So if I wanted to darken it, I can darken it. If I wanted to brighten it, I can brighten it. Now, here we can see we're getting a ton of artifacting, and that's because this is 8-bit phone footage. This is not the best type of footage to do this kind of specific color grading with because there's not as much information. Something like Red or A7S even would have a lot more information for us to work with. But right now, that's not important. What's important is for you to understand that you can use the eyedropper to select very specific parts of our image and have that area shown to us on the line over here so that we can make specific changes to just that one area. We can also make changes to the green values and blue values in this area as well, but we would have to create those same kind of placeholders on each one of these lines as well. So that's all cool. I'm just gonna reset this now and go back to the Y over here. Now we can see we have some sliders over here to the right. Personally, straight up, I don't use any of this stuff over here. You can use it if you want. Basically, what these sliders allow us to do is change the intensity of the changes that we've made in our graph over here. I kind of like to think of this as like opacity almost. So let's say we're making an S curve over here, okay? So with this point selected over here, I can now decrease the intensity of that point. And I don't know if intensity is the right word to use, if it's like the technically right term, but that's kind of how I see this. And once we bring it to 50, then we're basically bringing it, 50 is basically like 0. Once we go below 50, it starts to do the opposite effect. So in this case, we should be adding lots of contrast, but by bringing it down below 50, we can see that we are now doing the opposite. We are subtracting contrast from our image, and that's what's giving us this really weird, like grayish effect over here. So these sliders are available to us to play around with, and feel free to do so. I just think it's not the best because then this line over here, you can't like really use this line anymore to get an exact visual representation of what's happening because you're making a modification here, which does update the histogram in the background, and we can always view our scopes. But then this line, it kind of like doesn't make sense because now we're decreasing the intensity of what we've done in the line, but the line isn't updating itself. So in my workflow, I don't really use these sliders, but feel free to do so. Feel free to experiment, get crazy in here, find out what works best for you, and stick with that.